Welcome everyone to this evening's event, delivering on the Paris Climate Agreement, looking ahead to Glasgow. My name is Mark Howden. I'm the Director of the Climate Change Institute at the Australian National University. This event this evening is co-hosted by the British High Commission in Australia, the Italian Embassy in Australia, and the Australian National University Climate Change Institute. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on who I stand, that's the Ngunnawal Ngambri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, but also acknowledge the traditional people on the lands on who you stand. With the crucial Glasgow Conference of Parties being postponed for a year due to COVID, it is really important to keep the momentum for change happening. Partly because of events such as the horrendous fires here in Australia, the US, and other parts of the world, partly because this year continues the warming trend, even though it is a La Nina year, which usually cools the planet. In fact, there's a 2/3 chance that this year will be the hottest year on record globally. The remaining 1/3 chance is it will be the second hottest globally, falling short by the slimmest of margins. And it's really important because of the opportunities of a green recovery post-COVID. Recently, it's been very good to see the momentum behind the Paris Agreement continued in the recent G20 meeting, where most governments reaffirmed the importance of climate action on climate change. And also via recent announcements of net zero commitments by either 2050 or 2060, depending on the country, by more and more of Australia's key trading partners, and also by businesses globally. This evening, we've got a range of eminent speakers who will delve into these matters and shed more light on the pathway to Glasgow. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to note that there will be plenty of opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentations. Please type your questions in the Q&A box, and then you can vote on your favourite questions by clicking the thumbs up icon beside each question. So that way you can vote on which questions get answered. Also, please note that this event is being recorded and will be shared. If you don't want your questions to be identifiable, please submit them anonymously in the Q&A box. So now to our speakers. Tonight, we're really lucky to have as our first speaker, the Honourable Julie Bishop. As the 13th Chancellor of Australian National University, she's the first female to hold that role. Julie also served as Australia's 38th Minister for Foreign Affairs from 2013 to 2018. She was the first female in that position, as well as the first female deputy leader of the Federal Liberal Party, which she served in that role for 11 years from 2007 to 2018. As Foreign Minister, Julie was responsible for strengthening Australia's key strategic and economic relationships, with ministerial responsibility for more than 5,000 departmental staff, 110 overseas missions, as well as many key government agencies. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you, Mark, and welcome to everyone. This is an important event today. I'm joining you from Perth on the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I acknowledge our first Australians and pay my respects to elders past and present. I welcome envoys from the UK and Italian governments, which will be hosting the next round of UN climate negotiations in 2021, as well as other members of the diplomatic community. May I say to John Merton and Tosca Barucco, we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts 1 year ahead of the revised date of the COP. And we'll also hear from our leading ANU expert on climate policy and economics, Frank Jotzo. UN climate negotiations are important for all of humanity. So in Australia, according to the recent State of the Climate report, our climate has warmed on average by about 1.4 degrees Celsius since national records began in 1910, and by about 1.7 degrees above those in pre-industrial times. The 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, I was in Paris for that event, commits signatories to limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and to pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, here in Australia, we're already experiencing temperature rises that take us almost to the upper limit of what the world has considered to be acceptable and a safe and stable climate. In recent years, we've witnessed the devastating consequences of these temperature rises. The Australia's Environment in 2019 report, produced at ANU, demonstrated that record hot weather, drought, and a devastating bushfire season had damaged our environment and natural resources on an unprecedented scale. The report makes for grim reading, with rainfall the lowest in recorded history and 2019 by far the hottest year on record. We've seen our rivers run dry, large fish kills, and the lowest soil moisture conditions since well before 2000, all taking a heavy toll on ecosystems and farming. Crop growth was a quarter to a third below average, and tinder dry forests provided the fuel for our black summer that rattled the collective consciousness of the nation and left many reeling in shock from the devastation. It's estimated that 80% of the Australian population were affected in some way by smoke from fires across 6 states over 6 months. The ANU campus, for example, was closed for 4 days due to the haze from surrounding bushfires. Many are experiencing firsthand what we've been told for some time, that Australia is one of the most vulnerable nations, in fact, the most vulnerable of OECD nations when it comes to the impact of climate change. Now, times of great challenge require effective responses, and that can offer significant opportunities for our communities and economy. Here at ANU, we have more than 400 researchers working across multiple aspects of climate change and energy innovation, and I particularly acknowledge the work of Mark Howden, Director of the ANU Climate Change Institute. ANU economists have published multiple studies demonstrating that earlier action on climate change is the most efficient and effective response, and the cost of reducing greenhouse gas emissions are dwarfed by the impacts from a warming climate, increasingly unpredictable and extreme. Australia has plentiful renewable resources, and transitioning to becoming a net exporter of renewable energy can help drive our economy, as our researchers working on zero carbon energy for the Asia Pacific can most certainly attest. Air pollution is a significant environmental health hazard in many parts of the world, even the cause of some premature deaths. Reducing this pollution by ending our dependence on fossil fuels will drive enormous public health benefits, according to our health and climate researchers. Now, this list of benefits is by no means exhaustive. As Australia's national university, the only university established by the federal government under federal legislation, it's important that we are leading the research, the teaching, the dialogue about climate change, while also demonstrating leadership by taking action to reduce our own contributions to the problem. In February last year, we announced that ANU will move to below zero emissions as soon as possible. And during this COVID year, we've been working to develop a strategy so that we can become a sink for greenhouse gas emissions. We see this as a great opportunity to transition the university to a much more sustainable way of operating. And while COVID has interrupted our planning for this year, we'll be announcing more specific targets and a strategy early next year. Climate change is a global problem that requires a global response. And over the last month, for example, China has announced a target of net zero emissions by 2060. South Korea and Japan have committed to reach net zero emissions by 2050, and the EU has a long-standing commitment to this goal as well. And I welcome the commitment by US President-elect Joe Biden to rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement and for the US to reach net zero emissions by 2050. So it's vital that these larger emitters demonstrate leadership by committing to and meeting those targets. I applaud the efforts of the UK and Italian governments in building momentum for climate action around the world. So, in conclusion, to paraphrase Sir David Attenborough, it's not only about saving the planet, it's all about saving ourselves. So stay safe and please enjoy this discussion.
Thank you very much, Chancellor, for those introductory words, and I think really framed the importance of this issue and that we're discussing this evening. So the first of our speakers is Dr. John Murton. John is the UK's government's COP26 envoy. John has extensive professional experience in Africa, having researched his PhD in Kenya and had roles in the UK embassies and high commissions throughout Eastern, Western and Southern Africa. He's also been the UK's permanent representative to the UN in Kenya, amongst many other roles. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for the introduction. Let me just apologise in advance. I am giving this little talk from rural Kent, where we're all locked down at the moment as a result of the COVID-19 situation in the UK. And I have very poor internet here in Kent. So if I fade in and out, I apologise in advance. Also, I have small children who are waking up now. And so just occasionally, you may get a visitation on the screen behind me. So apologies in advance if any of that happens. So thank you for the chance to follow on from Julie's excellent introduction. I'm going to set the scene a little bit for COP26, which is the sort of next in the series of large COP meetings that follows on from the COP in Paris in 2015 and the COP in Copenhagen before then. And COP26 will be a little bit different than COP21 and COP16 before it, in that we're not trying to reach now a global agreement on climate change. That was done at Paris. And so the role of COP26 is more to demonstrate that the Paris Agreement can work. And you will all be aware that the Paris Agreement is strong in that it's universal and incorporates all 197 member states. But in some senses, it's unproven because it relies upon countries setting voluntary targets for themselves. And we have to show that that voluntary process can work and deliver meaningful climate action. And so COP26 will be a success in our view if we can resolve all the outstanding negotiations issues that hung over from previous COPs regarding the final elements of the Paris rulebook, including things like Article 6. It'll be a success if we can get all countries to commit to new long-term targets. As Julie mentioned, China has recently set a 2060 net zero target. Korea and Japan have set 2050 targets. The UK was the first country in the first industrialized country in the world to set a net zero target. Getting more countries to set net zero targets and getting more countries to come forward with new nationally determined contributions, which is the Paris jargon for a short-term emissions reduction plan over the next decade. So we need countries to come forward with all of those things in order to demonstrate that Paris works. And we will want also to have demonstrated that we can have involved non-state actors. The UNFCCC framework is one that's a framework between nation states, but we need to demonstrate that we can bring in non-state actors as well and enhance national ambition through the use of non-state actors, because in many cases now it's companies that are leading the debate on climate change, not governments. So we need to bring them in. One of the key things that will be important regarding the negotiations is to deliver on some of the commitments that donor countries like the UK and Australia have made in previous years. And I'm thinking particularly of the 100 billion a year of climate finance that donor countries promised in Copenhagen and then again at Paris to help countries, developing countries around the world to adapt to the effect of climate change, to be more resilient in the face of climate change, and also, of course, to reduce their emissions. And we're pushing donor countries ahead of COP26 to make good on that 100 billion a year, because that will be an important enabling factor in delivering agreement and creating the political conditions to deliver agreement at COP26 on the remaining elements of the rulebook. In terms of NDCs and long-term targets, we want to push countries now, and we've got the opportunity, thanks to the targets that have been set by China and Korea and Japan and others in recent months, to go and say, this is not just a Western European thing, setting a net zero target. This is something that actually all countries around the world can do. And it's in your economic interest to set a net zero target. And I can come on and discuss that a little bit more in a minute. And importantly, not just the long-term target for 2050, but also some shorter-term targets to demonstrate that actually this is not just sort of politicians' words that will be inherited by a future generation, but actually this is something that we're committing to here and now. And to support all this activity, we're working with 5 campaigns. We're developing 5 campaigns to try and encourage nation states, but also non-state actors to get involved in the COP process. And we're trying to demonstrate that actually you don't need all 197 member states of the UNFCCC to take an issue forward. And the example we point to is the offshore wind industry in Europe, where essentially 3 countries, the UK, Germany, and Denmark, have proven the concept of offshore wind and brought down the costs for all of the countries in the world now who benefit from the technologies at scale and the learning by doing that we've experienced in Western Europe. And it's the offshore wind industry is a microcosm of how we are bringing costs down in the low carbon economy generally, not just in wind, but also in solar, in battery, and so on. But it's happening very notably in offshore wind, just as it is in photovoltaics. The Economist magazine, which I think is well read in Australia, said in 2014 that offshore wind is staggeringly expensive and described it as one of the most expensive ways of marginally reducing carbon emissions known to man. And 6 years later, in 2020, we're anticipating the next round of offshore wind contracts for difference to in fact be subsidizing the national grid and operating on close to either negative subsidy or close to negative subsidy. So we want to demonstrate how coalitions of the willing can actually advance climate action in 5 areas. One is in adaptation and resilience, and helping countries adjust to the climate change they're already experiencing. And Julie mentioned the bushfires that we've seen in Australia and California this year, but there's also increased drought in many countries and also rising sea levels. And we've all sort of seen some of the distressing pictures from places like the Sundarbans with rising sea levels. So supporting countries to adapt and be more resilient in the face of climate change. We also have a campaign around nature-based solutions, which is to show how there's no trade-off between conserving our natural environment and protecting against climate change, but indeed actually activity that is traditionally associated with conservation, like protecting woodlands and protecting mangrove swamps or peatlands, is actually helping us in the fight against climate change as well, and making sure that our trading arrangements don't lead to environmental destruction. So we'll be working with major commodity producers and major commodity consumers to check the environmental impact of some of our commodity consumption, like soybeans and palm oil and so on. We have a campaign around zero emission vehicles to accelerate the transition to zero emission vehicles. If you put the UK, China, the EU and California in a room, you're setting the vehicle standards for more than half of global vehicle purchases. And so you can really make a difference with just a few small actors in a space. And penultimately, we have a campaign around energy transition to essentially highlight the successes we're having around the world in switching to renewable energy. And you'll be aware that 67% of the new electricity generation capacity that was added to the grid last year was wind and solar. So although the stock is quite small, the flow is beginning to become very large, and we're on the sort of cusp of an S-curve where we'll see a rapid acceleration now in the take-up of renewable electricity. That transition is happening, but we want to accelerate it so that we can meet our climate goals. And the final campaign is about finance, because where the financial world goes today, where markets go today, the real economy goes tomorrow. And you've seen several Australian banks divesting of their investment in coal. And the more that we can get banks and financial decision makers to take account of climate in their decision making, the faster we can accelerate this transition, because no one wants to be left holding a stranded asset as the world changes. We know that we need to work very hard in the UK to show leadership in this respect. I've mentioned we were the first country in the world, industrialized country in the world, to set a net zero target. But of interest, you might have followed my Prime Minister's 10-point plan speech that he gave just the other day, where he basically set out a vision that demonstrated that he thinks that greening the UK economy will be the secret of growing the UK economy over the next decade and more. And we've already seen over the last 30 years, the UK has been the fastest growing economy within the industrialized group of major economies, the G7, but we've also cut our emissions by more than any other country in the G7. So we've showed it's possible to decouple our economic growth from our emissions growth. And now we want to demonstrate that actually the low carbon economy is the economic growth frontier of the world. And we know that it's growing much faster than the rest of the economy. That's why Tesla is now worth more than Toyota. That's why NextEra Energy, a Florida-based renewables producer, has now overtaken Chevron and Exxon as the world's most valuable energy company. So in my Prime Minister's 10-point plan, 10 quick points. One is to increase the amount of offshore wind in the UK from 10 gigawatts to 40 gigawatts, which will power every home in the UK by 2030. Secondly, on hydrogen, to begin to develop a hydrogen economy in the UK, and he set a target of 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen production in the UK by 2030. Thirdly, in nuclear, to support the development of new nuclear stations as part of our commitment to ensure there's firm low carbon generation capacity in the UK grid, and look at small modular reactors. Fourth, electric vehicles, and our Prime Minister made a commitment last week to phase out the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles in the UK by 2030, 10 years earlier than previously, because the economics of that change are happening very quickly, and we want the UK to be at the forefront of that electric vehicle revolution to grow our economy. Fifthly, a campaign on public transport and greening public transport with zero emission buses. Six, a concept called Jet Zero, which is to work to support the decarbonisation of hard to abate sectors like aviation and maritime. Seventh, a commitment to greening our homes and public buildings to bring forward new building standards and to ensure the instalment of 600,000 heat pumps every year by 2028, a technology that would be fantastically suited in Australia with your widespread deployment of rooftop solar. Eighth, targets of 10 megatons a year of carbon capture, CCUS, in the UK by 2030 in order to help develop industrial clusters that support that. Targets on nature to ensure that we meet our 30-30-30 goal of 30% of our land and our sea conserved in nature conservation areas by 2030. And finally, announcements on finance, that we will be the first country in the world to make it mandatory for all our major firms to align their accounting with TCFD principles by 2025, all of which should actually drive an industrial revolution, a green industrial revolution in the UK. And we're very clear from our historical experience that setting those targets is the flip side of technological development, that by setting those targets, we send the incentives to investors that it's wise to invest in these areas because that's where the growth will be and that the government will support them in that. So I've probably used up my allotted time, and I'm very happy to take questions later, but I know that my Italian colleague will want to talk a little on many of associated issues. Thanks.
Thanks very much, John. You were spot on with your timing, and that was a really good coverage. I particularly liked the 10 points from your PM. That was the most concise and helpful exposition of those that I've yet heard. So well done. So our next speaker, or just before I introduce our next speaker, just to note, as has been sent in the chat, is that Chancellor Bishop won't be able to participate in the Q&A. And so any questions need to be directed to the other speakers. That's John Merton, Tosca Barucco, and Frank Jotzo. So now just to introduce Tosca, our next speaker. So Tosca Barucco is the Italian Special Envoy for COP26. Tosca's worked on climate diplomacy, multinational negotiations, particularly on climate change, on renewable energy issues, and with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Tosca was the Chargé d'Affaires of the EU delegation to Syria and also the Italian ambassador in El Salvador. Welcome, Tosca.
Thank you. And thank you, Mark. And thank you to all the organizers, the Honorable Julie Bishop, Chancellor of the Australian National University and former Minister for Foreign Affairs. I found our introductory address very inspiring, and she also motivated us on tackling this challenge that we have had together with our British friends. Many thanks also to the Climate Change Institute of the AENIU, the UK High Commission and the Embassy of Italy in Canberra for this timely event, which is the beginning of a very fruitful joint action plan in 2021 by our embassies in the High Commission in Canberra. I wish to give you a broad perspective of our multilateral engagement as the Italian G20 presidency is starting very soon. The G7 presidency, our British friends, is also approaching fast. We are partner in COP26, and now we are called to perform a series of simple tasks. Can you imagine how we can recreate momentum for multilateral cooperation against climate change and at the same time ensure a sustainable and green recovery from the pandemic? You really need a stronger partnership for these ambitious targets. Could you please put slide 2? Thank you very much. Both Italy and the UK are committed to reach net zero by 2050. We are strong supporter of the PCA and member of the High Ambition Coalition. Also, as a G20 presidency, we will aim to promote renewable energy as paramount for environmental sustainability. Smart grids and, generally speaking, the digitalization of the electric grid are essential tools to reduce emissions and enhance efficiency. In our G20, we'll also focus on inclusion and universal access to energy and contrasting energy poverty. Could you please put the slide 3? Italy has embarked in this adventure and meeting this challenge of being partner in COP26 as we sort of managed to do our homework. We reached the EU target in advance for emission reduction. We are the second country in Europe for production of solar. We have the highest percentage of recycling of all waste, 76.9% in the EU. One of the most sustainable agricultures. We emit 46% less than the EU average, and we have the lowest number of food products with pesticide residue. This is just a few examples of a commitment to nature. And also we have Italian companies, very strong. I just give a few examples. In Australia, we have the success of Eni, both in carbon capture and storage, financing research on microalgae biofixation to convert excess CO2 into methanol. Please don't ask me exactly how they do it. Italian companies are present on the hydrogen research, SNAM, and Enel Green Power is famous for the Bungala solar plant, and now is building at the Kohuma zero emission solar farm in Victoria. In ensuring overall coherence with COP26 priorities, and I wish really to thank John for exposing them so clearly, I believe that the G20 can play a key role in this respect. In fact, the 3P, people, planet, and prosperity, are in stronger synergy with the COP26 priorities. We've been witnessing during the pandemic that the urban dimension is key, so we will develop a concept as urban reforestation, sustainable mobility, renovation of buildings, and the energetic future of our city, together with circular economy. Those are key to achieving a sustainable way of living. One of our main priority is also the reorientation of global financial flows in the direction of a sustainable transition to enhance the public and private synergy. Can you please put the slide 4? Thank you. Thank you. It is also our duty to look beyond the immediate crisis and act for a sustainable, just and resilient recovery. We take action in line with the European New Green Deal and with the vision embodied in the Next Generation EU at large. This strategy, aiming at to achieve a climate neutrality in Europe by 2050, was launched last December. COVID does not yet hit the planet, but this long-term vision is now more essential than ever. We are committed to mainstream climate targets of 30% for both the multinational financial framework and the Next Generation EU facility each country that will use the recovery plan will have to include a minimum of 37% of expenditure related to climate. Negotiations are still ongoing on the package, but we strongly believe that we will succeed in this ambitious plan. Next slide, please. What are our national priorities, which are perfectly in line with our commitments of partners in COP26? I'm confident that the targets can be reached, and that thanks to Next Generation EU, we could invest some 80 billion in the years to come in the green transition. We should all reach climate neutrality by 2050 together. The pandemic has reinforced our common understanding of the fact that we're all part of nature, and the environmental degradation caused by our activities can likely make us vulnerable to future disease outbreak. Can you please put to slide 6? So what is our focus as partnered with the UK in COP26? Our focus will be on will be very exciting, will be on the role of youth, as we deem it imperative to engage the young generation in our decision-making process. So we decided to join the COP for Climate 2021 to the pre-COP, as we want them to play a key role in climate action. The pressure of the world youth remembers us that for their future, we cannot afford any longer to avoid taking bold decisions for our common house, which is our planet. Can you please put the slide 7? So we will have in Milan in September 2021, 400 young persons between 18 and 29 years old. There'll be hopefully 2 delegates for each UNFCCC party, and they will have the opportunity to draw up a concrete proposal for COP26. You will see a short video after my presentation on the Youth for Climate series. We think that we should reach the goal of the Paris Agreement in an equitable, inclusive manner, ensuring for the sake of our youth that everyone be benefit from the transition ahead. The destination is clear. Each one of us must urgently accelerate to achieve the goal of the Paris Agreement. That's how I ask to our Australian friends to join together with the Italy and UK to agree on a common path to rebuild back our societies and economies better in the aftermath of the pandemic. We cannot go back to business as usual. The cost of these transitions will be high, but the cost of non-action will be enormous. Please, can you put the slide 8? Thanks. In this slide, you will see a very innovative approach by our embassy in Canberra, which I want to thank as well for helping with this presentation. And also, I would like to tell that this is part of a global outreach with our UK friends, in which our embassies and high commissions around the world are working together to enhance climate action and make sure that in any country we pass common messages to the benefit of the fight against the climate change. Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you, and thanks to the audience. I will ask now to put the short trailer so the young can give us themselves what they think about climate change. Thank you.
Back to the Youth for Climate live series. Part of having this dialogue is talking to people from different continents, different experiences, generations.
The sense of urgency, where we are, where we want to go.
Ensure that young people are at the decision-making tables.
When you have youth involved deliberately and meaningfully, the conversation changes entirely.
So we cannot just focus on one aspect of the climate crisis. We need to focus on all the solutions.
We youth are and will be facing the impacts of biodiversity crisis.
Young people are the most vulnerable to these shocks and stresses.
Even in this pandemic, we have been able to hold the leaders accountable.
You have power in your storytelling, and that will help change the conversation.
You actually can shape and influence what happens next.
Young people are not waiting for others to do something.
So thank you very much, Tosca, for that talk and also that short film. Really helpful, and it's great to see Italy making such great progress as well. So our third and final speaker is Professor Frank Jotzo. Frank is an environmental economist working at the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy, where he directs the Centre for Climate and Energy Policy, which particularly focuses on economic reform and development. Frank was the lead author of the IPCC 5th Assessment Report, is now a lead author on the 6th Assessment, and has been involved in many policy and research and advisory roles, advising national, state governments, international organisations and businesses. Welcome, Frank.
Yes, thanks very much. It's great that everyone can be here. Let's go straight to the net zero targets that have been announced in recent times. And the COP26 process clearly is getting a real tailwind from these announcements. And I dare say it's a very useful focus on the long term, but not the very long term. That should be helpful. And of course, the change in administration in the US will make a very big difference. So what have we got? We've got legislated net zero targets in several EU countries, UK, political agreement at the EU level and in many EU member states, announced positions on net zero in Japan, Korea, several other countries, many other countries in fact. It's a law, it's in the law in some countries, including New Zealand. And we've got policy announcements or intent for net zero in many other countries. And then, of course, there's China and the United States. China net zero announcement of a goal of net zero for 2060, and the expectation that the US under President Biden will also take on a mid-century net zero target. So for China, this is of course hugely significant, right? Because it means that China sees itself very overtly as only about 10 years behind the mainstream of Western countries in decarbonization. So China has never really been seen to be that close to the pack in that clean energy and clean industrial revolution. There really is a crucial difference between China and other industrializing countries in the West, and that is that big wave of fossil fuel-based energy and infrastructure investment in China really came into place mostly between the years about 2000 to 2012. And there's still some building going on, of course, of fossil fuel dependent infrastructure, including coal plants. And what that means is that the target that has now been announced will mean that long-lived capital that is highly emitting will need to be phased out before the end of its technical lifetime. In contrast, in most developed countries, the bulk of the existing capital stock is relatively old and will need replacing before 2050 anyway. And so that net zero task in the West tends to be easier to achieve because of that reason. Now, we watch very closely the analysis produced by academics in China on how that target could be achieved. And of course, there's no certainty around particular pathways, but there's real clarity about the broad lines of decarbonization in China and in fact in all countries. And I'd be very happy to get back to that in Q&A later on in our discussion. So for China, this is actually more than anything economic and industrial strategy. right? So climate policy, low carbon policy, decarbonization objectives are very tightly connected with the idea of creating future economic advantage, becoming a large player in new industries, getting rents from innovation and high value added. Now, in America, the position that Biden took on this issue in the election campaign is actually quite similar to that. So it's very much about, as we would say in Australia, a jobs and growth agenda in the zero carbon economy in the US. And so the competition or the competitive situation with China, as you're quite clear, both countries will see this economically and strategically. And that's, of course, once again, I think, a very positive portent for the climate negotiations, because once again, we will see some jostling here among some large powers for leadership on climate change, which is, of course, a very positive thing for taking things in the right direction. And it's not just about targets, of course, it's about developing technology and deploying it, and thereby benefiting from that clean energy revolution. So a Biden-Harris administration is expected to push quite hard on climate change internationally, in multilateral of course, in particular the UN, but also in bilateral relationships. And of course, you know, when Washington wants something, then that will usually be heard in Canberra. And no doubt climate change will also figure increasingly in conversations between the UK and the Australian government. Japan, Korea, also tremendously important, of course, for us in this part of the world. The recently announced net zero targets here. There's not too much documentation available yet, but certainly what we can deduce from what we find published so far and what we hear from colleagues is that these are certainly not empty announcements. So just recently we heard at a webinar that we organized here at ANU from Japanese academic experts and policy advisors that you know, there's a very clear analysis and planning for a different energy policy that will see thermal coal use essentially phased out, and there's not really an altogether rosy future for gas use in Japan either. So that, of course, has important implications for Australia. Australia is a massive exporter of both coal and gas. Really, longer term, the writing is on the wall for fossil fuel exports of any kind. Exports of thermal coal, so coal used in power stations, will see declining demand probably most quickly. It's important actually to be aware of what's going on in Australia domestically. So the peak in domestic coal use in Australia was actually 12 years ago, and now our annual coal use is about 1/4 lower than in 2008, and it's falling at a quite significant clip. Now, for gas, there recently has been the idea in the political and policy, well, more the political and the policy arena, that somehow gas could fuel an economic recovery in Australia. It's very difficult to see how that could work. The gas expansion in Australia has very likely come to an end. I mean, gas production now is about 3 times higher than it was just a decade ago. And that expansion, well and truly, has come to an end. So difficult times, of course, for a large fossil fuel producer and exporter, not only because of the straight out economic effects, but also because of the very difficult political economy of declining industries. And, you know, arguably that is what explains a large share of the extremely difficult politics of climate change and energy in Australia, as we've witnessed that for well more than a decade now. The fact is that some industries will be declining, and really, you know, communities and politicians and policymakers will need to come to terms with that and focus on how how to do good transitions in that context. That really is the name of the game. There is thankfully a very large upside for Australia in all of that, and that is the really boundless opportunities that Australia has in renewable energy. So we could make really quite unlimited amounts, just practically unlimited amounts of hydrogen, transform that into ammonia, into synthetic zero emissions fuels down the track as well, especially when this becomes a topic for global aviation. We could be a very large exporter of renewable energy in those forms. And it could drive a domestic energy intensive industrial resurgence. We could be producing a lot of aluminium and steel in Australia with close to zero greenhouse gas emissions. And that is a very, very big prize that Australia could potentially reap by creating very large new value add in Australia while also helping other countries decarbonizing. What is needed for making all of this happen? Well, first of all, I would argue we need a proper national strategy for how to come to terms with the inevitable decline of coal and then gas, and how to make the most of the new opportunities, how to harness opportunities to reduce emissions in agriculture, in industry, in transport, in buildings, etc., etc. Now we see individual Australian states and territories embrace the change with massive investments in renewable energy generation in particular, and also the beginning of some strategic planning around this. Federal government in Australia will be under big pressure, like I said, from Washington, London, and other places. So the expectation will surely be, over the course of 2021, leading up into COP26, that Australia will take on a stronger emissions target for 2030. I would say, especially once a Biden administration submits a US target for 2030, which will inevitably make Australia's existing target really quite weak. And crucially, there will be expectations that Australia take on a net zero long-term emissions goal as well. I'll end on this thought. So the Australian Prime Minister and Energy Minister point out that it's no use having an emissions target, but not having any idea of how to achieve this. This is true. And so it is actually of paramount importance in our country that a meaningful long-term emissions strategy is produced over the course of next year. A process is what we need to properly assess the options, the technological options, the economic opportunities and difficulties, the challenges in the regional and social transition. And to really make this work, we need a process that has all the main stakeholders at the table and develop a widely shared understanding of the transition that we're facing and how we can make the most of these opportunities. And that, to my mind, really is the big opportunity in the lead up to COP26. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Frank, for that, and some really interesting sort of observations you made, and good argument you've presented. So we've now come to our Q&A session. We've got a whole series of questions, about over 30 questions now on the Q&A. Note that we're not taking questions through the chat function, just through the Q&A function, and anyone can get on the Q&A function and vote for the questions that they like, and we will ask those questions. Now, all the speakers, if you want to put your video and mics back on, if you can. And I'll just run through those questions. So we'll be working from the top unless there's a good reason why not to. Now, the first question was actually targeted at, I think, at Chancellor Bishop, but I think we can still address it. And I guess the question more broadly is, how can governments, including the Australian government, move towards positive leadership that actually takes on climate change and takes action on climate change?
Perhaps we should hear about the UK experience on this.
Thanks. Well, in the UK, we're fortunate where in that we have a bipartisan agreement on the need to tackle climate change. I think I'm correct in saying that our net zero legislation, which was passed 18 months ago, passed with only one dissenting vote in the UK's Parliament. So we have a bipartisan approach because we have a long history of sort of environmental conservation in the UK, and that dates back to sort of many years through organisations like the National Trust, but also a lot of people sort of my age are very familiar with issues like acid rain in the 1980s, and there was a lot of work done to reduce the sulphur emissions from our coal-fired power stations in the UK, which contributed to acid rain in Scandinavia, and we saw how that worked. But I would say one of the seminal things that happened in the UK was in 2006, there was a report published called the Stern Report. And the Stern Report made clear that the costs of tackling climate change were less than the cost of dealing with the consequences of climate change at a societal level, because there were many things, many sort of externalities that were not being captured in the economic equation, the cost of sort of pollution upon health and so on, and the costs of sort of dealing with falling agricultural yields and so on in the future. So since 2006, there's been that consciousness in the British body politic that the cost of tackling climate change were less than the cost of dealing with the consequences. But also what we've seen over a number of years in the UK is very rapid drops in the cost of renewable technology, such that we can very clearly see that tackling climate change is an economic opportunity. The green economy in the UK is growing 7 times faster than the brown economy. And we want that transition to continue, because if you listen to some futurologists like Tony Saber, and you go back to sort of 120 years in America, you can see pictures of Fifth Avenue at the Easter Parade in the USA in 1903, and you look down the street and there's a whole sea of horse-drawn carriages and one car. And then 8 years later, you look down the same street and there's a whole sea of cars and one horse-drawn carriage, because when technology flips, it flips very quickly. And we see the growth opportunities in that, and we want to be investing, as it were. 120 years ago, if you'd have been investing in horses, you'd have been investing in the wrong place. You wanted to be investing in cars. And similarly now, we believe that you should be investing in the low carbon economy to drive your economic growth. And an analogy I often use is these mobile phones. I did my PhD research in Kenya. And if you'd have said 25 years ago when I was doing my PhD research that there would soon be more phones than people in Kenya, people would have laughed at you, because you had to wait 7 or 8 years for the government to bring you a landline and make a connection to your house. But the private sector got involved, the technology converged around mobile telephony, and now there are more phones than people in Kenya. And you could look at it retrospectively and say, well, we could never afford the cost of investing in the infrastructure for mobile phones. But now when you look at it in the rearview mirror, you see we couldn't afford not to make that investment. It was essential for our economic development. And so we think it is with the transition to a low carbon economy. That's why our Prime Minister's brought forward the date by which we'll phase out internal combustion engine sales in the UK from 2040 to 2030, because that's the way the vehicle sector is going. That's why the markets recognize this. That's why Tesla's worth more than Toyota. And we want a piece of that in the UK. And similarly, my own Prime Minister, who in 2013 wrote an article saying that offshore wind couldn't pull the skin off a rice pudding, last week, 7 years later, was committing to power every home in the UK by offshore wind by the year 2040. So, the technology is changing and our views change with it.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. And embedded in my memory now is...
Maybe, sorry, one more point. So if I just add one more point, which has been really important in our debate, is the establishment of an independent committee on climate change, which gives independent advice to the UK government based around the science, and that depoliticizes the process and gives us advice. And we're waiting for advice, for example, from the Committee on Climate Change on what the level of our next NDC should be, so that we're on track to reach our net zero target in 2050. So the Climate Change Committee has been a welcome innovation, and I think they're in the process of establishing something very similar in New Zealand.
Yeah, thanks, John. They already, in New Zealand, they already have a committee which is very much modelled on the UK, and some really great pointers as to how to move forward. And the statistic that the green economy is growing 7 times faster than the brown economy, I think, is startling and tells a huge story in its own right. Tosca, you wanted to say something?
Yes, also in our future development movement and recovery plan, investing in the green economy is quite undisputed, and I must say we have bipartisan support in Italy on the fact that the greener the recovery, the better creation of new jobs will follow. So I must say that even after the pandemic and the emergency, there is quite a consensus approach with our government commitments, which are also in line with the EU climate strategy. So I'd rather say that it's now undisputed that investing in the green economy, also in Italy, is the place you want to invest. Thanks.
Thanks, Tosca. And I saw, Frank, you wanted to say something here as well.
I'd love to briefly pick up on something that you said, John, and that is the understanding about the economics and the fact that taking action is cheaper than enduring the damages from climate change. That is very well understood in Australia. It was convincingly established back in 2008 by the Garnaut Climate Change Review, a national review that came in the footsteps of the Stern Review. But the problem is that we've had a very unfortunate political debate over costs really ever since, which goes somewhere along the lines of, yes, climate change will be economically really bad for Australia, but we're a small country and we can do little about it. And so by not doing much, we will save some of the mitigation costs. And we are still in a situation where the discourse needs to shift to a shared understanding that this is coming, like it or not. You know, the green production revolution and the clean energy revolution, and by just backing last century's horse, we're not going to create a viable future for the Australian economy. So that's pretty much where the larger conversation is at. And just briefly on institutions, I mean, the UK, I think, really demonstrated that establishing an independent authority like the Committee on Climate Change can be tremendously important in this process. Australia has a similar institution to that, the Climate Change Authority. However, it has not had a role quite as prominent as you would think it should have had in recent years. But there's every opportunity, I think, for the authority to step up and well, not to step up, but to have the political spotlight on the work that they can facilitate.
So thanks, Frank. So our next question is about, basically, is climate neutrality, or going to net zero, sufficiently ambitious as a global target? In particular, I think this refers to going to 2050 in view of potential feedbacks within the climate system. So there's another question which comes down later, which relates to the carbon budget. So the carbon budget says we've only got about 9 years at current rates of emissions to before we burn up our budget that's consistent with 1.5. So perhaps if you sort of try to work those together. So is net zero by 2050 adequate? Do we need to go net zero by 2040? And how would we do that?
Maybe I can take a punt at it. I'm not a scientist, so you'll have to forgive me. We all face the issue that Frank just described. You know, all countries basically think they only contribute a small share to global emissions. I was just Googling it and checking what I thought I knew, which was that Australia has more emissions, more greenhouse gas emissions than the UK, even though you have a smaller population and a smaller economy. So we all have that issue. And every time we come up with a new environmental announcement in the UK, there's inevitably a pushback that, you know, we're just a small country, what does it matter? But the dynamics of that are really changing now. China, the world's largest economy, has just committed to net zero. 26% of global emissions. The UK and Australia are just, I think Australia is a little over 1%, the UK is a little under 1% of global emissions. China has just committed to net zero. That's 26% of global emissions. Japan, the world's third largest economy, by still a considerable distance, has just committed to net zero. And the Prime Minister in his speech to the Parliament said, it's the transition to net zero that will grow the Japanese economy. It won't be a cost. Korea has just committed to net zero. The EU, obviously, the UK, New Zealand and others, Canada. When Joe Biden becomes president in the United States and sets a net zero target for the US, I think nearly 75% of the global economy will be covered by a net zero target. So that's the direction the world is going in. And what we've seen very clearly is that when you set a target, you create the incentives for investors to invest in the technology to meet it, because they know there's going to be a market for it. And as the scale of investment creeps up, something called Moore's law applies. Now, we're all familiar with Wright's law, which is the sort of falling cost of memory of computers every year. That sort of the cost of memory halves every 18 months. And that's why you've got more computing power in the mobile phone in your pocket than NASA had in the 1980s for a sort of fraction of the price. There's something similar called Moore's law, which relates to the, Wright's law, which relates to the scale of manufacture. And as the scale of manufacture increases, the cost per unit falls. And that's why the cost of wind power has fallen sharply, and that's why the cost of photovoltaics has fallen unimaginably sharply, 85%. So the International Energy Agency is able to say solar power is now the cheapest electricity the world has ever had. And we can confidently expect that the cost of it will fall another 85% in the years to come. So I'm quite confident that once we've set these targets, technology driven by markets will deliver them probably faster than we anticipated. And we've usually seen that when we set a target, we've delivered it faster than anticipated. If you look at India, which is setting some really exciting targets, they've just set a target of 450 gigawatts of solar power. Now, to compare that, the UK installed grid capacity is 85 gigawatts. We've got 85 gigawatts of generation capacity in the UK. India's just set a target of 450 gigawatts of solar power to deliver it by 2030. And they think they have the confidence to do that in India, because previous targets they've set for themselves, they've easily smashed. And it's the same in the UK with offshore wind and other targets. We've smashed our targets as the cost comes down. But it's the flip side of targets. You set the targets, it creates the incentives to meet them. So I'm setting a 2050 target. It looks ambitious at the moment, but whether it's enough for the climate science, I'll leave the scientists to advise on, but it's what the Committee on Climate Change are telling us in the UK. But I'm confident that there are hard to abate sectors, and that's why we talk about net zero and carbon capture, utilisation and storage, because there are some still hard to abate sectors. But I'm confident that when we get to 2050, we'll wonder what the fuss was about.
Tosca.
If I may add something, we should also factor in the gains in energy efficiency, which at least in Italy proved to be a main source of emission reduction. Because what could happen is that if we all start to make our grids more efficient, if we start to invest more in research in the green sector, we also can find out that apart from the falling cost of renewables and batteries for storage of renewables, which is also very, very important, we may find out that we reached a successful target before. Again, we're not a scientist, but we should be confident that setting such a target will accelerate also technological changes that will prove us. I would be very, very happy if we prove us wrong in 2050, especially again for the young generations. Thanks.
Thanks, Tosca. Frank, did you have anything to comment on here?
No.
No. Okay. Well, maybe for the next one. So there's a question which is particularly Australian, which is about the Zali-Steggles bill, which does include a proposed climate commission, an independent climate commission with substantial powers. So the question really is, why can't everyone rally around that bill to actually make it happen? And Frank, this might be one for you.
Yeah, and it's the kind of thing that really everyone should be able to rally around and make it happen. And it's just an expression of the very of the fact that the politics on this are still in the ditch in Australia and federally, really, because it's the kind of thing that, you know, I mean, you can disagree about one detail or another, but it's the kind of you know, straight down the line, modern, forward-looking kind of legislative proposal, right, that you might want on climate change. And the hope, as ever, of course, is that, you know, there will be a softening of the political battle lines on this, and that eventually, you know, years or perhaps parliaments down the track, we will come to a situation as it exists in many other countries where climate change is no longer an issue or a flashpoint of bipartisan politics. That's where we should get to. I mean, you know, in Parliament right now, having these kinds of initiatives, even if they have no practical hope of being legislated, right, it's a very important role for them in terms of creating visibility for these approaches, and effectively forcing those who don't want to see anything like it to explain why this is possibly a bad idea. Right, and so I think from that perspective, I see that as a thoroughly positive thing. And of course, you know, for our international colleagues to also explain, we've recently seen a phenomenon where independents win seats in the Australian federal parliament by taking away a majority in an individual electorate, usually from sitting members who have a backward-looking position on climate change. Climate change really, in several of these seats, has been the deciding factor, probably deciding factor on that seat, shifting to an independent member of parliament who then campaigns on climate change. And so, yeah, you can see that as a sign of the strength of opinion, actually, among certain parts of the population, for sure.
Thanks, Frank. That's very helpful. So the next question is, given that climate change is a global problem, it requires a global response. What about a global levy on fossil fuels? I think, John, this might be one that you could cover.
Thanks. A global levy on fossil fuels would have to be agreed globally, and that is not an easy thing to do. You know, there are countries in the world, it'd be quite difficult, for example, I would imagine, to persuade Saudi Arabia to sign up to a global levy on fossil fuels, because, you know, it would undermine a core business. So I think that would be quite difficult. And what you see quite quickly is that in all these debates, whether it's a global levy on fossil fuels, and there's a lot of questions about border carbon adjustment mechanisms, which is a phrase I can never say, I always stumble over it. If you start talking about border carbon adjustment mechanisms, again, it's very, very contentious because it goes straight to the heart of trade issues. And a couple of people have mentioned in the chat that, you know, if you look at consumption as well, then the UK emissions have not fallen as sort of sharply as if you look at production, and that's right. But if you start saying, well, the way to correct that is to impose a border carbon adjustment mechanism, then you start running into a lot of problems. Now, we haven't got plans for that in the UK, but I know there are sort of countries who are muttering about it. Muttering is the wrong word there, who are talking about it. The EU is talking about it. Joe Biden has mentioned border carbon adjustment mechanisms, and it's possibly one of the reasons why China felt, you know, it was in its interests to set a net zero target in China. So, sort of, I think the discussion is useful, but it's a difficult one to bring to fruition in, you know, international negotiations.
Thanks, John. Frank.
May I add on that, you know, for our audience, a short description of a line of thinking in academic and think circles these days, and that's so-called fossil fuel supply side policy. So when you see climate change mitigation from the point of view of a large fossil fuel producer and exporter, such as Australia, but many other countries are in that position as well, whether it's coal, oil, or gas, then the big problem is that the market is being eroded for a product that you're heavily invested in, and part of the erosion of the markets is falling price. Okay, and so there is, at least theoretically, the opportunity for fossil fuel exporters to prop up the price by constraining supply. Now, you might think constraining supply is not in the interest of fossil fuel producer and exporter. Well, it is, if thereby you're doing the job that importing countries would otherwise do. So what we've seen happen is that countries that have a significant climate change mitigation policy in place, right? So just take Europe or UK as an example, have put carbon taxes or emissions trading levies or other policy instruments on the use of fossil fuels and thereby the import of fossil fuels. And the rent from those the economic rent from those restrictions, which you can approximate by the tax take, of course, goes to the governments of the importing countries. Right. So at least in theory, and to some extent, there is a way to keep some of that rent in the exporting countries and thereby have an incentive for fossil fuel exporting countries to actually constrain supply. So if you're looking for a historical example of that is, of course, OPEC, right? And of course, back in the 70s, OPEC in a way did the world a favor by upping the oil price and thereby incentivizing tremendous improvements in car efficiency, energy efficiency that came as a result of that.
Thanks, Frank. Tosca, did you have any comments on this, or do we move back to John because he wants to make a comment?
No, not really. I'm fine with the answers.
Okay.
Thanks. Sorry, Mark. Thanks for letting me back in. I was just going to sort of add another thought, which is that it's less that we need to impose a tax globally on fossil fuels. It's more that we need to stop subsidizing them through all of our subsidies, because basically Bloomberg does energy research around the world, and it's shown that already in 75% of the world economy, renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. And one of the reasons that the uptake is not even quicker than we're seeing, and it is really accelerating, is simply because there are subsidies that support the continued use of fossil fuels. So if we can strip those away, that's probably a sort of a much easier way to attack the problem than imposing taxes. And the economics, I can't overemphasize this enough. The economics are shifting so quickly. Already coal has been undercut around the world by renewables. That's clear. In India, they're putting on solar at 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour. In the UAE, they're putting on solar at 1.5 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's lower than the cost of transmission in the USA. That's to say that they are generating power on site lower for less money than it costs just to send electricity along the cable in the USA. And because that's unbeatable economics, and that's really going to shift things. So we just need to allow that to happen and accelerate it happening. Soon, even if your uncle gave you a coal-fired power station for your birthday in a country like India, just the cost of buying the coal and fueling the boiler and taking all the soot and ash away again would cost more than the cost of investing in new solar to produce the same amount of power. So these things are shifting really quickly. It's a trend that is happening anyway, but we can probably accelerate it by removing subsidies. The other thing we'll have to tackle is political will. So there are countries where even if the cost of renewables were free, there's a political problem in terms of managing a transition. And we see this in any place that's had a sort of a fossil fuel industry, whether you look in Poland or South Africa or wherever. So managing the politics of the transition and enabling communities who are heavily invested in, say, oil production or coal production to see that actually there are advantages, not just for the country as a whole, but for their local community in switching to renewable energy. That's a challenge. And so if you look in the UK, we have an established North Sea oil and gas industry. One of the reasons that my Prime Minister is focusing on a sort of investment in carbon capture, utilisation and storage and offshore wind in the northeast of England and in Scotland is to try and ensure that there's this transition from a fossil fuel economy to a low carbon economy so that jobs can be sort of, if you like, converted and taken across, and that minimises the pain of the transition that will inevitably happen anyway.
Thanks, John. And that's a great lead into the next question. And I'll just paraphrase this, but really is a concern about what does it take to make the Australian government more responsive on climate change. And so the question really is about, what can you provide advice on that may reduce the unwillingness to move forward in a way that's akin to what the UK does or what other European countries do. So you did cover some of this in your talk, that the green economy is booming, etc. But it is a question of, I think, in Australia, of political will and how you overcome that. Tosca.
Difficult question, because I can only tell you what worked in my country and see that some practices can be spread or also make put in innovative thinking. On the energy transition, I already mentioned the falling cost or renewable, the fact that you have lots of gain in the efficiency. What also worked, there was the awareness that electric and even bicycles as an alternative to mobility are useful, that you need the public regulator policies that make renewables, for instance, more accessible on the network to optimize, to reduce the waste in the connection, the digitalization of electric networks. Then it's a citizens' awareness and the importance of the transition in everybody's life that can put the right pressure to the people in the government. I wish just to mention something that I always found very, very interesting, is that we reintroduced in our curricula, even at primary school, environmental education. So what is working at the moment, of course, we are using now videos for most of the time for our schools to the COVID pandemic. But what has been introduced in our curricula is environmental education in a broader sense. So in the families, you see that there is, since there is from the children, a big push for the parents to adjust to climate-friendly policies. So I would say that the widespread awareness and public pressure can do a lot, together with a shift in the mindset of the companies. In the Race to Zero, thousands of companies are now joining the Race to Zero. And within the partnership, I had the pleasure to run events in Italy with Nigel Topping, which is the champion for this. So it's a combination of factors, but I think that public opinion can do a lot, as we can do a lot as individuals to lower our impact on the planet. Thank you.
Thanks, Tosca.
May I quickly jump in? The question, how can you change the politics? So I really have high hopes for a process that draws out very prominently what are the ins and outs of decarbonization, what are the economic opportunities and costs, how can we do that, what are the technologies. A process that has emphasis on that, and that gets done in a way that it is inclusive beyond, say, just the inner circles of government departments. If such a thing were to happen, right, then the facts which are overwhelmingly in favor of action to prepare for decarbonization and get it underway, those facts would speak for themselves. and I believe would help overcome the entrenched political narrative around the difficulty of taking action on emissions, because that narrative is really no longer based on very much evidence at all. It's just become a kind of a myth that's there. And so the more sunlight that can be put on that, the more transparency and the more emphasis on that, I think the better. And I'm truly hopeful for that for the next year and lead up to COP26.
Fantastic. Okay, and so we'll just perhaps take one more of the questions that's on the board at the moment. And so this one is really about offshore energy production, and as in renewables, and essentially the question is about how do you establish the regulatory environment needed to deploy offshore wind, given that in Australia we're not able to do that at the moment?
I'll just throw something in quickly. I mean, really, I can't speak too much to the regulatory issues around offshore wind. I think we could learn from the UK. There are, as far as I'm aware, efforts underway towards potential offshore wind off the coast of Victoria. But end of the day, for Australia, the story is a really simple one, and that's still massive opportunity for onshore wind. Unlimited opportunity for PV, and great opportunity for energy storage as well. So we don't even have to get very fancy in this continent to do it at very large scale and cheaply.
Thanks, Frank. Are there any particular experiences in the UK or Europe about offshore wind overcoming barriers, perhaps social acceptance barriers, etc.?
Well, from the UK, the big push for offshore wind in the UK essentially came from local communities not welcoming onshore wind farms, because, as you know, wind turbines are big and getting bigger, and the new sort of 10 megawatt, so people didn't want them near their houses. And the UK is a small, crowded little island, as you will all be familiar with, and so there was a lot of push to put them offshore. And once we began putting them offshore, we discovered actually the winds are steadier and more reliable. And you can put much bigger turbines offshore because they are offshore and no one objects to them. And so some of the big turbines that we're putting in now in the North Sea are up to 10 megawatts. I think there are some 14 megawatt turbines on sort of on the order book. And to give you an example of the scale of that, if one of those 14 megawatt turbines blades rotate once, that will power a house for 2 days. That's the kind of scale we're talking about now, that these are big beasts, and you can install a lot of them, and hence we're hoping to put 30 gigawatts of power on offshore in the UK in the next 10 years. In that sense, targets help because you're giving the investor certainty, which lowers their cost of capital, which is one of the key determinants of cost of renewables. But as we're having more and more schemes, we're having to sort of look at a more advanced planning framework, because every offshore wind farm has a sort of a landing point for the cables. And so we're looking to see what we can do to bunch those together, so we're not having more landing points than are required, taking up more sort of coastline for those landing points. There's also talk about putting a sort of a ring main around the North Sea, so that you can link the all the offshore projects together, and you don't have to bring in cables from everyone. And the Danes are taking it a step further with plans for energy islands, where essentially they create artificial islands in the North Sea that can then be used to power up their grid, but also use surplus wind power when we're generating surplus wind power to produce things like ammonia and hydrogen, and to power the low carbon economy. And in that sense, just to sort of go back to one thing that was said earlier about what might be helpful in Australia, is one of the things we found since setting our own net zero target, it has helped us with our long-term planning, because we avoid going down cul-de-sacs. If you only have a succession of 10-year targets, there is a risk that you could say, actually, we could save our emissions by sort of 15-20% by switching from coal to gas, for example, like we did in the UK. And that's fine if you want to meet a short-term target, but if you're actually heading to zero, that might not be the economically rational option anymore, particularly if your net zero target is only 30 years away, because you invest in a gas power station now, you'd have to amortize the costs much more quickly if you're heading towards a net zero target. So you risk ending up holding a stranded asset. So in that sense, the net zero target has helped us plan long term and start thinking about what makes sense to get to zero rather than what makes sense to hit an intermediate target.
Thanks, John. That's actually a really important point there at the end. Now, I'll just take Chairman's prerogative to ask a question of each of you, because the focus of this particular event very much was on the pathway to Glasgow, so the year ahead of us. And I guess the question for each of you would be something like, in that year, the next 12 months, what ideally would you like to see happen that will help Glasgow be successful? So perhaps if we start with you, Tosca.
Thank you. My biggest aspiration would be to see the process revamped, to see that the emerging narrative on the green recovery gets mainstream in many countries, that we don't use the COVID as a pause button for climate action, because what we are getting is just the opposite, that is a global challenge and has given back energy to fight for public common goods. And climate change is an existential threat, and fighting climate change is, for me, the essential public good, as it's also linked to health. So if we don't see, I would say we should look for a new decoupling that is fighting COVID doesn't mean that you have to step back on climate. And the other thing I would say is the reinforcement and the revamping of a multilateral framework. If we are going to be back to multilateralism, I think we will have more space to join forces together to tackle the question of the SDGs on how to achieve a sustainable growth, how to sort out the climate finance issues for developing countries. So if we go back to the concept that we cannot face existential threats alone, but that you need a global response and put back in place efficient mechanisms for a sound multilateralism in which everybody can give a contribution and get also rewards, that for me would be the best aspiration I have on the road to COP26.
Thank you, Tosca. Frank, if you keep the comments brief so we can finish on time, but what would you ideally like to see in the next year?
I'd like to see a Biden administration firmly in place and pull through with all the things that that we expect they would do. I'd like to see, perhaps friendly rivalry but cooperation between the US, China and Europe on climate policy. And I'd like to see a strong emphasis on the road to COP26 on long-term emission strategies and strong encouragement, right, to say the least maybe, to those countries that haven't done such an exercise yet to make it happen, because I think that's really very important in domestic processes.
Thank you very much, Frank. And lastly, John.
Thanks, Mark. I'd like to see us all look to 2021 and be confident that just as we've changed all our behaviours with COVID, and made really successful sort of strides in the fight against COVID through concerted international effort and change of our behaviours, so we can have the same optimism that if we apply a fraction of that effort to tackling climate change, we'll be successful in the fight against climate change. And I want to see the G7 presidency that the UK will be chairing through next year be the first G7 where all of the G7 industrialised countries have committed to net zero, leading us through to CHOGM, where our Australian cousins will be alongside us, and then the G20 just before COP26, so that by COP26 we can demonstrate to the world that we're on an irreversible and accelerating trend to a low carbon economy.
What a fantastic way to finish this evening, John. But I really want to just thank all of the presenters and also Chancellor Julie Bishop for making tonight such an insightful and inspiring and ultimately, I think, a very positive evening as we hear those ideas about how we can move forward to a better and brighter future and a very successful COP in Glasgow next year. So thanks everyone, and thanks very much for the participants and your wonderful questions as well. Okay, cheers, have a great night.